Hi everyone, it's Dr. Damien. Today's topic is consumer involvement. Consumer involvement is a level of concern for or interest in the purchase process. Once that purchase process has been triggered by the recognition of a need that a particular purchase could satisfy. While it's often referred to as purchase involvement, consumer involvement is distinct from product involvement. Product involvement refers to the level of interest or concern for a particular product category or even a brand. So if you are someone who's particularly interested in or passionate about cars or fashion, you would be high in product involvement. However, consumer involvement wouldn't actually exist until you recognized a need to purchase a new car or some new fashion. So how interested are we in purchases? Well, it's largely a factor of the personal relevance to the purchase process for us. When we talk about the personal relevance, we're really referring to the degree of perceived risk. The easiest way to think about this is in terms of financial risk. So when something is relatively low in financial risk, we won't be that concerned or interested in the purchase process. If we're only spending a few dollars, we're not going to spend a lot of time worrying about whether or not we've made the right decision. However, if someone is very high in financial risk, if, for example, you're going to buy a new car or a new house, you're going to be really concerned and involved in the purchase process. You're going to spend a lot of time researching information, evaluating the alternatives, weighing them up and make sure you're going to make the right choice. Perceived risk isn't just about financial risk. We can also consider social risk. So something might not be particularly expensive, but because the product is consumed very conspicuously and everyone can see it, there is still risk at play. So for example, if you're buying a dress to wear to a wedding or some new shoes, there is some degree of social risk involved. So you're going to be more concerned for and interested in the purchase than if it's something that you consume only in private. Other types of risk involve physical risk. So when something could potentially do us harm, we're going to be more involved in the process. So purchasing new tires for your car, okay, you might not be that interested in the process, but you're relatively concerned and you want to make the right decision, because if you don't, there could be some physical harm caused to you and your family. We could also consider performance risk. How important is it that the product works every time, on time? And finally, a factor of personal relevance could be psychological risk. So for example, would purchasing this product go against your principles and potentially do you psychological harm? It's worth mentioning that these factors are individual specific. So what might be a very expensive purchase for someone on a very basic income might be a very low involvement purchase for someone who is a millionaire and they won't give much thought to it at all. Similarly, some individuals will find a purchase very stressing and concerning because they're concerned about their appearance or have a personality trait that makes them concerned about what others think. Whereas for other individuals, they won't put much thought into that at all because they're really not concerned. We can visualize consumer involvement existing along a continuum from low, where an individual has very little interest in the purchase process, through to high, where the person is so involved in the purchase process because there's a great deal of risk associated with it. Where a purchase falls on that continuum will impact the consumer decision-making process. So at the extreme end, when there is very low levels of concern for or interest in the purchase, the consumer will often engage in what is referred to as routinized response behavior. With routinized response behavior, the consumer has experience with the product category. They've probably bought it before, and therefore they require very little information search. They know the brands that exist, they know the brands that they like, and they might even engage in a brand loyal decision. An example of a routinized response behavior would be purchasing milk from your supermarket. You probably give it very little thought. You rarely search for information about the different types of milk. You might not even compare the prices. You know the brands that exist, you know the one you like, and you often buy it again and again. As consumer involvement increases, so does the amount of time a consumer is willing to put into the consumer decision-making process. Limited problem solving is the next stage in the decision-making process. This is when the consumer has some basic understanding of the product category. They know the brands that exist, and they know how to evaluate brands based on their performance or their price. They might not have fully established brand preferences, so they're willing to conduct some information search to allow them to fine-tune their decision-making. An example of limited problem solving would be buying fashion. We don't buy the same brands of fashion all of the time. We change our minds based on further information search, based on what we believe is fashionable at the time, based on what we believe is a good price, based on what we believe suits our personalities. Another example would be buying a new smartphone. We've all had experience with the product category before. We've purchased smartphones before, but there's new features to compare, to evaluate. They're not all that cheap, so we need to consider the financial risk involved in making such a large and expensive purchase. When consumer involvement is very high, individuals often engage in what is known as extensive problem solving. With extensive problem solving, the consumer often has very little experience in evaluating between the brands within the product category. They might not even know what the brands are, and they might not know what criteria they should be basing their decision on. The consumer will need a great deal of information, so they'll conduct an extensive information search, and they will be very, very careful on how they evaluate their alternatives. These types of purchases are often very expensive, so they're high in financial risk, but they could also be high in social risk too. These types of purchases are also often first-time purchases, as first-time consumers know very little about the product category, and they have to engage in extensive problem solving. An example of extensive problem solving would be buying a car for the first time. If you've never purchased a car before, it's really difficult to know what criteria you should be basing your decision on. How do you determine whether the car is of good quality or not? How many kilometers is too many for a second-hand car? What features are really important to you? How do you compare the difference between good quality tires on a second-hand car and old tires? You need to conduct an extensive information search, and you're probably going to rely on the opinions of people who have purchased cars before and have gone through this experience. In summary, we can consider consumer involvement being the concern for or interest in the purchase process, ranging on a continuum from low to high. When consumer involvement is very low, consumers often engage in routinized response behavior. As involvement increases, consumers engage in limited problem solving. And as consumer involvement reaches high levels, then the consumer is willing to go the extra mile and engage in extensive problem solving.